Strategy, authored by Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran of the Wilson Center. My name is Sheila Jasmine, and I will be your virtual host for today's event. Before we begin today's event, please allow me to warmly greet our panelists. Please welcome Mr. Joseph Wanandi, Vice Chair of the Board of Trustees CSIS Foundation, and Mr. J. Kristiadi, Secretary of the Board of Directors CSIS Foundation. Thank you for joining us today. Before we start the session, I would like to announce a quick rundown of today's event. This webinar will be opened by Dr. Shafiah F. Muhibat, Deputy Director for Research of CSIS Indonesia. The webinar will continue to the main session with Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran providing a brief summary of his book and Dr. Rizal Sukma as the discussant. This session will be moderated by Mr. Gilang Kembara. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Shafiah F. Muhibat to give her welcoming remarks. Dr. Shafiah, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Sheila. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants. Welcome to today's event. And most of all, welcome to, of course, to Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran. It is our pleasure at CSIS to host today's book discussion, a book, again, by Dr. Prashanth, titled Elusive Balances, Shaping U.S. Southeast Asia Strategy. I think it is an interesting time that we are in at the moment, and very timely also to be having this discussion. I think in the past 2 weeks, we have been preoccupied with the Russia-Ukraine situation. Experts have begun discussing one way or the other about the possible changing of geopolitical dynamics. Some of the main questions are, would the Atlantic Alliance, so to speak, be back at the center of geopolitics, looking at what's going on in Ukraine at the moment? And also, is the US's focus will shift ultimately to Europe and the North Atlantic Alliance, again, looking at what's going on in Ukraine. So I think this is a very timely discussion and also a very timely book discussing about US Southeast Asia relations. I think when we discuss US Southeast Asia relations, the main question that always arises is about the commitment of the US. There are great expectations that we have here in Southeast Asia, and throughout history we have had multiple US presidents claiming commitment to the Asia Pacific in general, and it is generally claimed that the US has interests in Southeast Asia, interests that by time have kept on growing. But again, looking from the perspective here in Southeast Asia, of course, there remains questions about how committed is the US really, especially when we start comparing the US's commitment with the involvement of other major actors in the region. There are, of course, various domestic issues in the US that have played a significant role in deciding this commitment. And I think it is very important for us in Southeast Asia to also understand more about this factor, because I think this is something that might be lacking discussion here in Southeast Asia. I do note that these are some of the issues that are being discussed in the book. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today. I'm sure that Dr. Prashanth will, discuss some of the issues that have been mentioned, and also maybe answer some of the lingering questions that exist here in Southeast Asia. So again, thank you for having this book discussion with us at CSIS. This is an issue that have always been the focus of research for us in CSIS. So we look forward to having this discussion with all of you. Thank you, and I hand back to the MC.
Thank you for your warm remarks, Dr. Shafiah. Now we will begin today's main session. Our main session will be moderated by Mr. Gilang Kembara, researcher of the Department of International Relations, CSIS Indonesia. Mr. Gilang Kembara was born on March 1992 in Jakarta. After obtaining his master's degree from the University of Birmingham, he joined CSIS in 2015. While having a profound background on strategic studies and Asia-Pacific, he is expanding his knowledge toward the maritime issues. He has also managed to contribute to several writings in local journals and newspapers. Now, without taking more of your time, I invite Mr. Gilang to start the session. So, Mr. Gilang, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Sheila, for the warm introduction. And very good morning to everyone, to all of our attendants that have joined us today at the book launching event of Elusive Balances, authored by Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran. It's an honor for me to moderate the book and also this event. I think it's a very timely, considering what we've gone through in the past couple of weeks. I think the attention needs to be shifted back towards what exactly how the U.S. has put their attention, also commitment within the Asia-Pacific, if not the Indo-Pacific region. And I think the book that's been written by Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran here provides a new perspective, or at least a new way of thinking of how we quantify and weigh in the U.S. commitment within the region. I mean, we all know about how the United States plays a balance of power with its rival and also its other adversaries across the world and also in the Indo-Pacific region. But with the Elusive Balance books, we came to learn that there are also commitments that the U.S. wishes to balance with, that the U.S. has contribute, or how it ebbs and also flows throughout the year, and that the various periods that the U.S. have put themselves within the region and how it differs from one another. I think the book has provided a very good insight on how these commitments and how the U.S. foreign policy have shifted throughout the decades, throughout the 20th and also 21st century. Now, I'm not here to summarize and also provide the gist of the book. I suppose we have the lead author to do this for us. We have about 30 minutes of time here in the main session in discussing and analyzing and presenting and analyzing the book. We have the portal author, and let me just provide a brief background of the author, Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran. Dr. Parameswaran is a fellow here with the Wilson Centers of Asia program, where he produced an analysis on Southeast Asian political security issues, Asian defense affairs, and United States foreign policy in the Asia Pacific. Dr. Parameswaran is also deputy head of research at the consultancy of Bauer Group Asia and senior columnist at The Diplomat, one of Asia's leading current affairs publications. So we have about 20 minutes for Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran to provide the context and also analysis of his book, followed by 10 minutes of discussion with Dr. Rizal Sukma from CSIS Indonesia later on. I hand the floor to Dr. Parameswaran. Please, you have 20 minutes.
Great. Thanks a lot, Gilang. Thanks a lot, Shafiah. And I see also a lot of familiar faces here as well who have joined us, who have written a lot about this topic and also the region, Pak Rizal and Pak Yusuf. So I'm actually looking forward more to the discussion rather than my comments. So I'll try to be as brief as I can in terms of summarizing the argument and some of the key findings. So as has already been alluded to, when I wrote this, I certainly wasn't predicting that we would have this kind of timing in terms of a discussion of the book, but actually current events have coalesced to make it a very sort of fortunate timing to discuss the book. On the one hand, we have the Biden administration that's rolling out its Indo-Pacific strategy, and that's got an increased focus on Southeast Asia, including the upcoming US-ASEAN summit, assuming that everything goes according to plan. But on the other hand, we also have Russia's invasion of Ukraine that has preoccupied global headlines, but also raised questions that are not new, but a sort of new round of questions about US commitment, about whether the United States can, quote, walk and chew gum at the same time, whether the United States can focus on the Indo-Pacific, but also, sort of make those adjustments in terms of its posture in Europe, and also confront some of the issues dealing with Russia. And these questions, the book argues, is not new. In fact, for the post-Vietnam period onwards, after the end of the Vietnam War up to today, the book argues that this is really the big question. Why do we keep seeing ebbs, flows, and imbalances in US commitment to Southeast Asia? And this is a repeated question if you just go back to the recent, the past sort of 20 years and the 21st century, you had the Bush administration, which came into office, and before the September 11 attacks talked about strategically competing with China. But after the September 11 attacks, it became very sort of narrowly focused around security and counterterrorism, which had very significant consequences for domestic and foreign policy. Now, the Bush administration made a lot of other advances selectively, the signing of the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, for example, but a lot of that was overshadowed by significant issues that the administration faced. And then we had the Obama administration, where it started off very promisingly in terms of the US pivot and the rebalance. But consistently during the administration, there were issues about resourcing, about the actual commitments that the United States can make to Southeast Asian countries in dealing with the challenge from a more assertive China and places like the South China Sea. So it seems like whichever administration, there's always some kind of issue or challenge with respect to US commitment. And obviously, under the Trump administration, you saw a major drop off in terms of US commitment in certain areas, in terms of diplomatic commitment, in terms of economics. Some Southeast Asian countries were finding themselves in new disputes rather than the United States playing a more proactive and positive economic role in the region. So the book's argument as to why this occurs and why I started exploring this was that, no matter who I talk to in the US, including policymakers, former policymakers, and in Southeast Asia, everyone seemed to agree that the issue of ebbs, flows, and imbalances in US commitment to Southeast Asia existed. And it also didn't seem to be the case that some of the sort of the offhand sort of speculation about why this is occurring didn't seem to make sense. It is definitely not the case that US policymakers don't understand that this is a problem. This has been written about consistently, and some of the major critiques of administrations are, you need to focus more economically. There's too much of a security focused commitment. So that is really not an argument for why the United States is not making this happen. And similarly, in Southeast Asia, there's a tendency sometimes in the United States to say Southeast Asia is a very difficult region to engage. It's extremely diverse. And I understand that this is an extremely diverse region, but other regions of the world are also quite diverse. And the United States seems to be able to find ways of committing there as well in a more balanced fashion. So those arguments really don't really pass muster. The argument the book makes is that this is largely due to the confluence of issues that US policymakers have between what the book calls elusive balances. And that's elusive balances in two senses. Elusive balances in terms of how US policymakers balance between changes in power, perceptions of threat, and resources that can be mobilized to confront those threats. Those are the sort of three major variables, and very difficult for US policymakers to get all three of those right. So that's on the US domestic political side. But then you have balances on the commitment side as well. So US policymakers ideally would need to, in terms of the commitment level to Southeast Asia, they need to not only commit militarily, but also need to make sure that this is balanced in terms of diplomatic commitment, in terms of economic commitment, increasingly also in terms of education, people-to-people exchanges, and so on and so forth. And in terms of the balance of commitment, US policymakers also need to make sure that they are balancing between ideals and interests, for example, not overemphasizing democracy or human rights, but also, as we saw in the Trump administration, there was a lot of uncertainty about the commitment of the United States to these very freedoms and ideals that it was talking about a decade or 2 decades ago. And similarly, on economics and security, you can go down the entire list: bilateral versus minilateral and multilateral institutions, how the United States engages with ASEAN versus the Quad and AUKUS. So doing all of this is immensely challenging in that context for US policymakers. And the book looks at sort of 4 cases of administrations that are trying to do this during periods where the relative power of the United States in the regional and international system is changing. So it looks at the post-Vietnam War period, the post-Cold War period, the post-9/11 period, and the post-global financial crisis period. So you'll notice that the book intentionally avoids discussing this in terms of administrations. One of my big beliefs doing research for the book and publishing it is that I really don't see this as being the case that it's a particular group of administration officials that have a misunderstanding about Southeast Asia. I think these are very structural, deeply rooted issues in the US domestic political system. So just to give a few examples, during the post-Vietnam War period, we now know, based on declassified documents, that the Nixon administration in the 1970s was consistently trying to, on the one hand, convince Southeast Asian countries that it was committed to Southeast Asia, while essentially retreating from the region. And there are any number of declassified documents of Richard Nixon basically saying any variation of sort of, our commitments can't be kept, but we need to make sure that our adversaries think that they're going to be kept. And that's the major question for US policy. There's diplomatic cables coming from US ambassadors in Southeast Asian capitals saying Southeast Asian countries are not convinced. And yet individuals in Washington are stuck trying to balance between how they're trying to convince one audience, the Southeast Asian audience, that they're doing enough, but then convincing Congress and the domestic audience that they're doing just about right with minimal amount of resources. And that sort of audience problem is very much at play during the post-Vietnam period. In the post-Cold War period, I think Goh Chok Tong sort of summarized it very well, the former Singapore Prime Minister, when he sort of said, essentially, after the end of the Cold War, the sort of lack of a unifying threat led to an increase in diverse domestic interests in the US political system, such that the United States, under the Clinton administration in particular, is where you saw this. When the question was asked, what is the United States doing in Asia, and including in Southeast Asia, it was, well, we're advancing, economic commitment, security commitment, and democracy, and we're going to do all of this under this sort of banner of enlargement and this notion of a Pacific community. And that sort of extensive notion of US commitment that ended up, because there wasn't that disciplining device of the Cold War that provided that sort of geopolitical lens, led the United States to be quite unfocused. And we saw that eventually with respect to the Asian financial crisis, when the United States actually, did not end up committing to Southeast Asia. And actually that still continues to be one of the periods where we look upon unfavorably as being a period of US commitment. And the other two cases are the post 9/11 period and the sort of post-global financial crisis period. I won't touch on these two periods because I think they're pretty apparent in terms of the issues, but just to say, on threats, since there are three major variables on the domestic political side in the United States, that's power, threats, and resourcing. On threats, 9/11 is a perfect example where the Bush administration and a lot of the individuals that came in, including Richard Armitage, for example, had a very clear sense, just like they had under the Trump administration, that China was the major strategic competitor of the United States. That wasn't new. That was something that was done 20 years ago. But then, all it takes is sort of a series of attacks on the United States domestically for the entire US domestic political apparatus to sort of shift to the Middle East. And it's very hard, even for some of the Asia policymakers in the Bush administration who I interviewed, consistently said, in spite of what they tried to do, that we need to do more in Asia, that we need to do more in Southeast Asia, it was extremely challenging for the United States to sort of have a sense of what is termed sort of threat hierarchy, right? And then in the post-financial crisis period under the Obama administration, that's probably the one where I think there was a lot of promise, but a lot of under-resourcing, right? And you had an administration that was trying to advance a vision for Asia and Southeast Asia, but doing so in the context of the financial crisis, where the United States did not have nearly the amount of resources to do so. And so you saw a lot of shortfalls in terms of US commitment, in terms of the economic commitment bit, for example, lots of new US initiatives, but they weren't really followed up on in terms of resourcing. And obviously US commitment in the South China Sea on the security side also suffered in that regard. So I end up where sort of the Biden administration is today. And I would say, to the Biden administration's credit, I think the officials get it. They understand the record of US commitment, the issue of US commitment. But the issue, as the National Security Council Senior Director Edgard Kagan said a few days ago in Washington when he was talking about the Indo-Pacific strategy, is yes, we can say anything we want, but ultimately we know that the region is going to judge us based on our actions in a sustainable basis. So will the United States actually make sure that its resourcing and defense budgets are going to be focused on Asia as the primary theater rather than being shifted to Europe, or really not shifting at all in terms of a focus on the Indo-Pacific? Is the Indo-Pacific economic framework, which is still being rolled out, is that going to actually be able to resemble anything to be able to replace the withdrawal of the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was quite disastrous for US commitment? And one of the arguments that the book makes with respect to these periods of ebbs and flows of US commitment is that these are not cost-free. When an administration engages and then disengages, there's what one official that I talked to summarized very aptly as being sort of a double negative, essentially. So the United States comes in, gets everyone excited about the region, and other countries, including Southeast Asia, get excited about this, and China engages more, Australia engages more, Japan engages more, and then the United States withdraws. And what you have essentially is the next time the US re-enters the region, Southeast Asia has moved on its own terms. The security environment is different, the economic environment is different, but also other major powers are continuing to play a major role as well. And I think that's kind of where the Biden administration finds itself. So amid the talk of the US-ASEAN Special Summit, it is the case that if the Biden administration is seeking now a sort of expanded, sort of comprehensive strategic partnership, it's in a sort of dimension where both Australia and China have already reached that with ASEAN last year as well. So that's just by way of one example. So what can be done about this? I'll just spend a couple of minutes on this because I want to sort of get to the discussion. I don't think this is easy. First of all, I mean, it's quite easy for me, writing the book to sort of say what can be done or what should be done. But I think there are a few things that US policymakers can do. I think one is making sure that the floor of US commitment to Southeast Asia is higher, so that if there's a future administration where we see a drop off in US commitment, it doesn't fall to as low of a level. And this is a huge structural problem for US commitment in Southeast Asia, because absent Thailand and the Philippines, which are still pretty informal in terms of the actual treaty alliances, the United States doesn't actually have a whole lot of other security commitments and economic commitments and diplomatic commitments. And even the ones it has, the few it has, like the US president showing up every year to an ASEAN summit, is not a guarantee, and the United States could actually slip back to that. So one of the recommendations the book advises is that US policymakers should try to increase the number of commitments the United States has that it can keep. That's, a lot of the strategic and comprehensive partnerships, as Kurt Campbell, the Indo-Pacific coordinator, has talked about, is one way of doing that. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is an informal way of doing that. But again, without binding commitments, it's going to be very difficult for the United States to prevent a future drop-off in commitment. And that's really the focus of the book. With respect to sort of the balance of commitment question, right? One is the level of commitment. The other one is sort of the distribution of commitment. The economic question is really important because the United States finds itself now out of trade agreements and the region has essentially moved on. So the United States will have to eventually get back in that game. I don't see, unfortunately, here in Washington, an environment to do that in the immediate. But I think there is a recognition that the United States needs to find a way to do that eventually. On the issue of power, threats, and resourcing, those are the sort of domestic pieces. I talked about how commitment can be sort of advanced in terms of level and distribution. I would just say, the perception, at least that I get, and the surveys sort of, confirm this, I think there is a sense, a growing sense in parts of Southeast Asia that if you look 20, 30, 40 years from now, and you have a China that maybe is distrusted still, but is continually committed to the region, and you have a United States that is distant and is only periodically engaged, the problem is that 30, 40, 50, 60 years from now, no matter what China does or the United States does, if it continues on this ebbs and flows pattern, China is eventually going to outpace the United States, not just as an economic power, but even on the security sphere. And China is already beginning to do that. So this notion that the United States is a security provider and China is only an economic provider, I think we're way past that. And I think the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies surveys show that as well, among others. On resourcing, I've already talked about the fact that the United States, has to find a way to actually back up its commitments with actual financial commitments, because there's a whole record on the economic side of the United States coming up with frameworks under the Obama administration, the US ASEAN Connect initiative under the Biden administration, and earlier the Blue Dot Network. But a lot of these are concepts that are often not followed on with actual resourcing. And the consistent point that the book makes is that the United States is not competing with the worst version of itself. It's competing with China and other countries in the region that are providing actual commitments. So on infrastructure, for example, Japan, as one Southeast Asian official mentioned to me when I asked about US-China competition, said, well, it depends on what sector you're looking at. If you look at infrastructure, I don't really see a US-China competition. I see more of a China-Japan competition in that sphere, right? So the United States has to get that sort of resourcing bit right. And on threats, I would just finally say on this, threat hierarchy is extremely important. So it is the case that the United States is a global power with global responsibilities. But the United States will have to find a way to say, in terms of its budgeting, its resourcing consistently, that the Indo-Pacific in general and Southeast Asia in particular is the priority region. And the problem for Southeast Asia is that Southeast Asia started off as being a region that was of indirect interest to the United States, but Southeast Asia is becoming increasingly important for its own sake. But US policy has not caught up to that. And I think until US policy is caught up to that reality, which could take a while, US policymakers are going to have to find a way to bridge that gap. And so I'll end on that note, and I look forward to Pak Rizal's remarks and the broader discussion as well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Prashanth. Very, very good point there and the summary of your book. And I'm really interested to hear about the projected vision that you said in 20, 30, 40 years to come, when a distrusted China, but yet a committed one in the region would be much more popular, much more acceptable than an intermittent United States involvement within the region. And I think it speaks volume of what the future would hold if such trend would be, would continue into the future. So thanks a lot on that notions. And now we'll be going into our discussant for today, Dr. Rizal Sukma. Just a little bit brief background. Dr. Rizal Sukma is a senior fellow here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He was previously the Indonesia's ambassador to the United Kingdom and Ireland and the International Maritime Organization from 2016 to 2020. Pak Rizal, you have 10 minutes for discussing what Prashanth has spoken. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilang. Good morning. It's good to see you again, Prasad. I think we first met, like long time ago, right? In Tufts University. I think, when you were there. But since then, actually, I have really learned a lot from your, work at the Diplomats, because that, I think publication has become, one of the premier sources, for many, IR scholars and policy analysts in Indonesia and of course, around the world. So I think your work, in that publication, has been very useful to all of us. So and even though now you already move on, and I think you will, give even greater contributions to the understanding not only the U.S. foreign policy, but also, on many issues, in Indo-Pacific. When I was a PhD student, I can't remember how long it was, since 1993, I was told, by my late supervisor that, a PhD dissertation should contribute to the existing human knowledge. This is the English traditions, of IR. And then those existing human knowledge actually can be in three forms. One is the discovery of new data, and second, the presentation of new interpretation of the old, data, and then third, which is I think one of the most important part of the research, is actually to come up with the new theoretical framework to understand the issue that we are looking at. So I think one of the most important, I think, contributions of your work or this book is actually, in its attempt, at theorizing, as you said it in the book, why the repeated cycles of changes, to U.S. commitment to Southeast Asia. So I think this study of commitment, actually already enriched a number of studies on foreign policy in general, which range from, say, some studies, focus on reputation, some studies, focus on credibility of, a foreign policy act, and also on the questions of the nature of foreign policy commitment. So here, I think your study will be very useful, in looking at, how actually, we can try to explain, the variation in the level of commitments, and also balance by taking the U.S. policy towards Southeast Asia as the case study. So that's, I think, where it's easier, for us to really see the greatest contribution of your work, And second point that I would like to make, I haven't actually, this is a confession, I haven't really read, through the whole book, but I finished the introduction, some part of the analysis, and of course the conclusion, and it actually remind me of those debates in the old years, when we were all undergrad students. It is actually a well-structured and well-argued, a book, and also well-grounded, in the parsimonious theoretical framework and tradition of realism. And then you yourself, actually confessed that you are more attracted to the classical realism. So it really, strongly anchored in the American IR tradition. It's actually tried to explain. Those who studied in, in England, IR England, so more interested in understanding, so rather than explaining. So, but that's, a debate for another day, So I think, we should leave that aside, because it's not going to, have any conclusive, result, this debate of the explaining or understanding. But I think when you look at, the framework that you use, the independent variable, and then the intervening variables, and the commitment as the dependent variable. So actually, within that framework, of course, we can explain a certain shift, certain variation, in U.S. Commitment to Southeast Asia. But other, I think, scholars or researchers, of course, can always come up with different set of variables. So that's, I think, one of the challenge, for any scholars, who try to use this academic tradition in order to explain a certain social phenomenon. No matter what variables that you use, there would always those who argue that, no, what about this? What about the other variables, and so on. But of course, the second lesson that I learned from my lead supervisor back when I was a PhD is that in social science, including in IR, one particular interpretation is true for that particular framework that you use. So there is no, I think, a domination of truth, which explanation is the most correct one. So you can't get into that. So it's basically, a certain explanation is correct, based on a certain framework that you use. So that's, I think, the second part that I learned from your book, which of course, will benefit any other, students of IR who are still doing research on their either masters or PhDs. So this is the methodological, I think, lessons, even though you don't, state it very directly, in the book, but that's, part, I think, will be useful for the emerging scholars of IR like Gilang and others, who still yet to do their, PhD in this interesting subject. The final point is more questions, actually, because, this framework, you applied it across a couple of, case studies, but of course, then, we can assume that we should be able to use this framework to also try to anticipate, I'm not using the word predict, anticipate the variation of level of commitments and balances, Trump, era. In your book, of course, in the conclusion, you also said that, this framework, you encourage other people to use the framework to apply it to other cases than the United States. But, in this context, probably we are more interested in looking at how you use this framework in order to try to anticipate the variation, in the level of commitment and balance during the Biden administration. Will we see which factors that we should focus on in order to anticipate when and on which particular variable that will change? So because we can expect that, say, if Donald Trump becomes president again, then of course the level of commitment and the balance will also be affected, because the threat perception and the calculation of the state capacity is very much, I think, dependent on which group of policymakers that came in and then try to wage these two intervening variables. So if you can highlight, or at least give us the preliminary assessment on which are the variables that we need to focus on. The power shift is already there, so that's basically we can look at it. But I think the two intervening variables, to what extent they will change, and then will also affect the level of the commitment. The final point is that yes, that commitment is very important, but again, I think most of us in Southeast Asia and in for that matter in the whole world, more interested also in the credentials, which stem from, of course, the ability, to pursue whatever commitment a country has, and translate that into policy action. So here, I think there's also a problem, with the U.S. foreign policy, not only towards Southeast Asia, but also across the issue. It really depends, on the domestic political mood, which is, I think, fast changing at the moment. Then again, nobody can predict what's going to happen in the U.S. and then whether they will be, committed, to what the current administration, has put in place. So once again, congratulations, and I think, we should, all be grateful to Prasad, and I really hope that you can, continue. The latest article that of yours that I read is actually in the National Interest magazine, where you try to, I think, anticipate some of the trends, in the Biden administration, especially within the Indo-Pacific strategy, and that I think it should be also useful for all of us to understand and anticipate the U.S. foreign policy towards Southeast Asia. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pak Rizal Sukma. Before Prashanth can reply to Pak Rizal, perhaps I just make a confession. I'm also a product of the English school in my years during undergraduate and postgraduate, but practicalities and day-to-day lessons have taught me that there are, I'm more averse now to a lot of theoretical studies that came from the American side, and that's what we see now today. So thank you so much for that, Pak Rizal and also Prashanth. Before I open the floor and also take the questions that I have right now, I may want to start, get the ball running by using my powers, my prerogative powers as a moderator, and probably also try to provide a question to Prashanth. I'm quite intrigued by this, the notion that you presented in the book, the balance of commitment, and also that in the classical realism, there's also balance of power that have always been around for years, that have been used by scholars and also policymakers alike. But in the recent weeks or months, especially since the new Indo-Pacific strategy that has been published by the United States government, I see another term that's been put out now by the U.S. government, that is a balance of influence, and it's stated there within the Indo-Pacific strategy that the United States seeks to build the bridges between the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic, and that they will partner to build regional connectivity with an emphasis on the digital domain, as well as to uphold international law, particularly in the maritime space. So I suppose there's this notion that the United States wants to counterbalance the influence that's been around, that's been created by China and other countries that have been put within in the Indo-Pacific region at the absence of the United States since the pivot to Asia in the 21st century. So I mean, the question is then, how does this fit well into into your perhaps your theoretical methodology, and perhaps how this translates in the future, and how the United States can try to maintain this three terms, power, commitment, and also influence in the Indo-Pacific in the future. So I suppose I'll leave it at that for Prasad to answer and also to reply to what Dr. Sukma has provided in his discussion. So Prasad, please.
Well, thanks so much, Gilang and Pak Rizal. Good questions and set of comments. So I will start with the first part of it, which is what variables to look at in the Biden administration, and then also whichever administration comes after it. I think there's probably the resourcing or state capacity, state power variable is probably the one that I would say is the most significant and salient now. Whether you look at sort of political polarization or resource constraints. And I think that's affecting the economic side, but I suspect as well that that's already affecting the defense side. If you look at the global posture review that came out last year, that basically was not able to say anything definitive. And some of the budget items on the defense side in Asia did not look very favorable. And this was even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I do worry about that sort of variable, and I think that's a really important one to watch. I think on on threats, I would say the threat hierarchy notion is important. I think the threat level, I think you can definitely feel that there is this sort of bipartisan consensus about being tough on China. I don't think that there's agreement on what exactly to do about that. But I think there is the sense that at least the people who are for engagement or a more sort of productive approach are definitely not the ones who are the loudest voices now. But I think the question is really there is this sort of informal sense of hierarchy being the intended hierarchy is sort of China being the first tier threat, and then you have sort of Russia, North Korea, Iran as being those actors, and then non-traditional security challenges under the administration. I think some of the events that we're seeing definitely sort of contest that sense of reality, including the China-Russia dynamics amid the crisis in Ukraine. But also, just frankly, I am never entirely sure with US policy as to whether a sort of tougher approach to China will necessarily be sustained under, say, a future Trump administration. Just because I think under the Trump administration, there was a sense that the official policy bureaucracy was tougher on China. But the president himself, depending on the day of the week and some of the decisions that were made and the issue, could sort of swing back and forth. And I think in publishing the book, the editors asked me the question, which is, why don't you insert a chapter about the Trump administration on its own? And frankly, it's extremely tough to put this sort of framework, which is a focus on policy, with that kind of more an administration where it's a little bit more difficult to see the contestation between official policy and some of the leading administration officials who are running it. So I do think that that's a really important consideration in terms of the variables. I will say that the Biden administration seems to get that this balance question is important. I don't necessarily think that that means that they will end up in the right place, because it's extremely difficult. But I definitely think that they understand that there needs to be an economic piece to this. It can't just be all about security. I think they do understand that the sort of rhetoric around the democracy summit may not necessarily find itself very receptive in all of Southeast Asia, particularly at this time. And so they might have to adjust how they're talking about this in the months to come. But we'll see if that actually translates into reality. I think Pak Rizal's other comment, I don't want to sort of mischaracterize it, but it was a question about commitment is one thing in terms of what is promised and what is set out to do, but follow through and credibility is quite another in terms of the ability to do that. And I do think that that's a very important commitment. I mentioned the case of Richard Nixon, where literally, you could go through sort of policy paper after policy paper where the administration officials are spending all this time trying to convince Southeast Asian countries that commitments are happening when they're very sure that they're actually not happening. So I do think that that perception versus reality issue is important. And follow through is a particularly important notion because we aren't really sure, even really just not even the 2024 election, just look at the 2022 midterms. There are already huge concerns that the Biden administration may suffer some unprecedented defeats, and then that's going to complicate U.S. policymaking towards Asia in the next 2 years, particularly because, you know, one of the consequences of there being a tough domestic political environment around China that's bipartisan is that it's going to be very difficult to try to get some sort of strategic framework for stability around the U.S.-China relationship when there is that environment. And that was what was lacking in the Trump administration. I think if I were to say one thing about President Trump, I think he sort of broke the consensus for engagement in China in ways that the Obama administration could not do. And that was something that was really difficult. It was looming in the US policy context, but he did it. I don't think, though, that we are sort of at a place where there's bipartisan consensus around the idea and approach towards China. So I think that's a very important variable. I just want to briefly address Gilang's question on balance of power and balance of influence. I think that's a really important signal from the White House that they understand that, you know, one of the key audiences that they're engaging is Southeast Asia, that already has seen so much uncertainty over China, but also AUKUS and the Quad, particularly because I think these could have been messaged initially in a very different way for different audiences. I think they get it. And I think they're trying to talk about this not in terms of hard power, but more on the along the lines of influence in a more comprehensive fashion. Of course, that's complicated by the fact that the Indo-Pacific strategy was, as you guys know, was released on a Friday afternoon, right before the Russia-Ukraine crisis. So there's doubts about, you know, that messaging rollout and all of that. But I do think that the content of the document is really important, along with the fact that, of course, you know, Secretary Blinken announcing it in Jakarta was also an important signal that Southeast Asia is an important part of that question.
Great, thanks. Thank you so much, Prasad, for the comment. We have two questions now in our question and Q&A box addressed to you. Allow me to read the two questions. We have one from Wafa Karisma. It's three sets of questions for Prasad. He asked, first thing is, do you think that the United States should prioritize between the various fronts of engagement, or whether they should keep them as spread out or as varied for as much as possible? Second is that what is the current state of Southeast Asia's position or leverage inside the United States Congress and domestic audience? And his third set of question is that how would the need of a unifying threat that you have traced from the records of United States commitment abroad play out with the Southeast Asians' ideals of do not frame our engagement into an against any country or against China idea? How would you reflect to the increasing need to looking at the Ukraine invasion and paying more attention into framing the behavior such that we will not invoke security dilemma to our neighbors? So that's the three sets of questions from Wafa.
Oh, sorry, Gilang, did you want me to respond or?
That has been killed by President Trump or axed by President Trump. I don't know whether you have you copy all that questions. I think my internet just went up and down. But I welcome you now to answer those two questions, Prasad, please.
Sure, no problem. These are really good sets of questions. I think, on the prioritization of fronts in terms of military, economic, education, I think the U.S. military on the security side, that's the U.S. strength. I think there needs to be a lot more work done, and even on people-to-people ties. I think the United States does have that sort of power of attraction and soft power. There are still some issues, including visa and the sort of geographic distance, there are other competitors to education. And I think that's the other sort of piece, right? Traditional US strengths like security and education, other powers are competing for that as well. But I think the big one is really the economic piece, I would say, and the diplomatic piece. On the economic piece, it's just the reality that absent the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, there really isn't a sort of binding framework for the United States to engage on free trade agreements in the region. And China's moving forward with it, but also, I mean, there's RCEP and CPTPP. So it's not all about China. It's the fact that Asian economic integration is moving forward without the United States. And the United States needs to find a way to sort of plug into that. And diplomatically, I would just say there still is a debate in Washington about like the utility of ASEAN, engaging ASEAN, should the president go to the summit, and what other crises there are. And the argument I make in the book is actually quite simple, which is when the United States agreed to join the East Asia Summit, there just needs to be a more sustainable way of dealing with the problem. I mean, if the United States can attend, if the president can attend, we should just make that clear that he can. If not, should be represented by a high-level official. And I think ASEAN being seen as an important vehicle to engage on the region's needs rather than why it's important to the United States is probably the key question, right? Because it's one of the factors undergirding peace and stability. We can argue about the extent to which that is, what are the other variables, and so on and so forth. But that's essentially the question of regional needs versus US interests. I think on the current state of Southeast Asia's position and leverage inside the United States, domestic audiences, I think that's a really important question because, to my mind at least, here in Washington, there still is an embarrassing lack of knowledge about granular issues in Southeast Asia. I think there are a lot of think tanks that are doing good work. There are a lot of universities that have expedited that as well. But within the policy-making community, the reality is that even within Asia, it's still dominated largely by Northeast Asia and other parts of the region. Southeast Asia first sort of officials who are schooled in Southeast Asia are not sort of leading the top jobs in the administration yet. Now, obviously, this could change in the next 5, 10, 15 years. We're slowly seeing those changes. But we also need to evolve into a position where individual people are advocating for specific countries, right? So whether it's Indonesia or Vietnam, for example, that is really the position we're looking for in the US domestic context. And, in the US Congress is a similar dynamic. There isn't a whole lot of, there's very limited bandwidth in terms of engagement on Southeast Asia for its own sake. Now, if you attach it to China or you attach it to some other question, it's easier to get traction. But then you end up with a question that you're pleasing the domestic audience, but it looks to Southeast Asia as if you're engaging from the prism of China. So that audience question is still a major issue. On the question of, how would the need of a unifying threat play out versus don't frame our engagement against China, it's a mixed bag, right? To be frank, it is really difficult. As I said earlier, we're dealing with a sort of multi-decade process where Southeast Asia initially in the post-World War II period was a region where the United States engaged in largely militarily in a very indirect sense, mostly to prop up Japan and in the context of a world war. But increasingly, the story is that Southeast Asia is rising for its own importance. And the story of the last 20 years, to my mind, is not that the United States pivoted to Southeast Asia. It's that everyone is pivoting to Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia itself is changing. The position of mainland Southeast Asia relative to maritime Southeast Asia, the changes, including on digital, on climate, they're not going away. So that is really the sort of big question. I frankly, based on what I'm seeing, if I were to speculate, I don't see this idea of the United States engaging Southeast Asia for its own sake necessarily being the case for every single administration. I think the Biden administration gets it. I think the Obama administration got it as well. But I don't think we are at a level where we can expect it in a way that, I'll just take a contrasting example, Northeast Asia as a subregion or India as a relationship, right? In US-India relations, we see extreme bipartisan continuity in terms of engaging with India, in spite of domestic changes. And there's actually a lot of focus on India in Washington. I don't see that for any comparable country in Southeast Asia yet. But that could just be me being very my pessimistic self. And hopefully, in the next few years, I may be actually sort of proven wrong. I see a question on there about, the current Biden administration and reviving the TPP that was killed by Trump. I kind of briefly addressed that earlier, saying that that's probably not in the foreseeable future possible, only because there's two issues. One is that the Biden administration, at least for now, in the early start, the U.S. Trade Representative has engaged trade from a perspective of a very domestic lens, through workers to free trade to labor and so on and so forth. And the model is, sort of the USMCA from the Trump administration. So I'm not so sure that we have gone past that yet. And the other question, obviously, is that it requires congressional sort of consultation. And Trade Promotion Authority expired last year, and the administration did not renew it. So they would have to seek that. Very difficult to do in a midterm year. Perhaps they'll get it, and then eventually they can find their way back into the relationship. The easier pathway would be either a sectoral agreement, like the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, DEPA, for example, or some kind of U.S. digital agreement, or the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. My big worry, though, with the IPEF is that this is another one of those frameworks that one administration can do, and then another administration it just falls by the wayside. And the issue is not that this happens. The issue is that the United States is asking Southeast Asian countries to make commitments and to hedge their bets when they're not sure about what the next U.S. administration is. So that's very challenging, right? So I think that's the real challenge on trade policy in the TPP.
Great. Thanks a lot, Prasad, for that comment. Now we have also a question here from Dr. Shafiah, a very short question here for you. She asks whether the Quad and AUKUS and whether these will impact United States engagement with ASEAN, and whether there will be more minilaterals in the future, or whether minilaterals will shape United States engagement in the Indo-Pacific. And I think this will be the last question, I think, for you to answer. You can also put in some concluding remarks before we end the event today. So please.
Great, thanks. I think it's a great question. I would say it seems like minilateralism is kind of in for now. It seems like doing things smaller, both minilateralism and I think sector-based cooperation seems to be in, because it seems to be difficult to get a lot of big things done. But I would say, just on the Quad versus AUKUS, it does seem that the Quad is slowly evolving into a mechanism that is, at least the geopolitical issues, including China, are being addressed in a more private sense among these countries. But the public-facing part of the Quad is more about providing public goods, shaping standards, educational scholarships, and so on and so forth, which makes it more palatable to multiple audiences, rather than the argument about, is this about China or is this not about China? When it's really a China and sort of conversation. I'm not so sure about how AUKUS is going to evolve. It's a very different mechanism. But also, there was an opportunity for Australia, the UK, and the United States to, when they announce it, actually put more of a focus on this being a sort of regional mechanism as well. And all of these three countries are engaging significantly in the Indo-Pacific and in Southeast Asia, not just on a security basis. But there was a decision not to do that. But that was a decision that was taken in the context of the post-US Afghanistan withdrawal, where there was a case to be made for the United States to illustrate its enduring hard power. I'm not so sure. The big question to my mind is, just like we look at the Quad now and say, this has evolved from where it was a few years ago, will we see a similar evolution with respect to AUKUS? And I don't know. For me, as sort of optimistic side of me says, if the Quad is a mechanism that provides public goods and Southeast Asian countries benefit from it, I could see in the future informal participation in some initiatives that the Quad does on an occasional basis. It depends on how it evolves. So I would say, ideally, the mechanism for U.S. policy is to come up with ways to converge on all of these. So the Quad should try to engage ASEAN, try to engage other institutions. But this is a very difficult thing to do because it requires agreement from all 10 countries within ASEAN and the United States and all of the Quad members. And the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, if anything, has proven that that's going to be even more difficult on that very issue. But I would also just say, by way of conclusion, thank you so much to everyone who are joining today, and thank you so much to CSIS for hosting the book discussion. I get a lot out of these discussions, and I hope to soon make it to the region to see all of you in person, hopefully when the pandemic eases.
Great, thanks a lot, Prasad. Rizal, do you mind providing us a brief concluding remarks before we end the event?
Well, thank you. I think, I just say, thanks to Prasad, on behalf of all of us, at the CSIS, and also those, who actually follow this discussion. So now, we can, I think I would like to suggest that we all add, Prasad's book into the list of books that we need to finish, in reading. So, we can, enrich ourselves in understanding about the U.S., engagement of foreign policy towards Southeast Asia. So within that context, there are two very short, I think, notes that I would like to make. Number one, I've met a lot of, say, Southeast Asian diplomats or policymakers, and then most of them actually have the same complaint when it comes to the US. It's about access and then the recognition and respect, from the government circles in the US is very difficult to get. So, it's even, to meet with the member of Congress is also already, big challenge. So that's, I think, something that, we need to really rectify, to address if the US really wants to have, full, engagement and strong commitment, on Southeast Asia. The second point is that I think the US government need to support all those Southeast Asian programs, in think tanks in the US, so that, this think tanks engagement between the US, think tanks and Southeast Asian think tanks, can start again. So because this is also one of the platform where, this issue that you raised, the lack of, understanding, lack of knowledge, and so on, within the policy making circles, probably can be addressed. So these 2 points that I would like to put, out there for all of us to consider, and then try to find ways how we can address them. Thank you so much, Prasad, once more.
Thank you very much, Rizal. Thank you so much. I hope Prasad would make it very easier for you to meet your own congressman or congresswoman there. I don't know whether, I'm not sure DC is represented there in the House of Congress. But thank you so much again for everyone that's joined us today. And Prashanth, it's been a pleasure to have you here, albeit virtually. We really love to have you here in the region. I hope that all these restrictions will be lifted in any time soon, so that we can have a normal face-to-face meeting in the near future. So thank you so much for today. Thank you so much for everyone. I'll give the floor back to the MC to close the event formally. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Gilang. Thank you to all panelists for the fruitful discussion today. Ladies and gentlemen, we have finally come to the end of the event. On behalf of CSIS, I would like to give my deepest appreciation for your attendance today. May what we learned during the discussion today expand our knowledge further. Thank you, stay healthy, and see you at the next CSIS event.